In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to It's Not Just in Your Head with myself, Max Golding, and Dr. Harriet Fraud.
Hi.
And so we had a plan for today, which was to respond to some listener feedback we got. There's a little a Google form in our show notes that you can respond to at any time anonymously if for some reason you don't feel like, if you don't feel like emailing us, if you have like some sensitive critical feedback or something else. So anyway, there's a bunch of feedback in there. We were going to respond to a couple comments. But then I shot this idea to Harriet earlier today, kind of last minute, to do an episode on... so this is very personal. It's actually about my dad having passed away last Saturday, six days ago, as of today. And I felt kind of torn about it because it is a very private thing. But I'll kind of explain why in a minute, and Harriet will chime in on why it actually seems relevant to talk about something like this. So I'll just kind of start on this note. So I've mentioned in my background in the earlier episodes of our podcast that I did grow up in a quite blue collar kind of working class family. There's a decent amount of domestic violence and a lot of complications, and that my dad has been homeless for actually most of my life, and I had been estranged from him for roughly 10 years or so. All of his siblings on his side of the family also, they didn't know where he was, no way to contact him. And this is probably kind of rare in the US, but it's also probably kind of relatable for a lot of people in just being estranged from your parents, and there being a lot of a complex history of whether it's domestic violence or sexual abuse or alcoholism or something, and then families being kind of torn apart, and there being a lot of weird stuff and people not talking to each other. Mm-hmm. And so my uncle, who I am relatively close to, had told me last Sunday in a voice message, say, "Hey, I got news that your dad deceased. Got a call from the coroner's office, yada yada." And so just a couple things, because the point here isn't like me doing therapy with some this small listener audience we have, but actually to talk about death a little bit. Death, aging, health. We could probably talk about healthcare and things like that. But also the fact that he was relatively homeless. I mean, so there was a maid at the motel where he was staying, and I think the reason he was in a motel is because Gavin Newsom and in California, since the pandemic hit, a lot of unhoused folks were kind of just placed into motels. That's probably why he was in a motel. But this maid who came out found him in this chair where he went out to smoke cigarettes outside of his motel room, and he was just slumped over and he was dead. She called the 911 and he was already dead. And the whole point of our podcast is sort of where are these intersections between sort of the emotional and relational and all of that, and the political, like sort of political economy and everything. And so in this situation, so first of all, it hit me a lot harder than I thought it would. And this, I've talked to a lot of friends now who I realized that they had parents die who they were estranged from as well. Apparently this is really common. This is something that I think even in grad school and all the psych textbooks and therapy training, I never really came across this, but apparently it's quite common when you're really estranged to actually have sometimes a bigger reaction,
Yes.
heavier emotional reaction, because there was so much sort of incomplete and confusing and how messy things had been, versus if you're in a kind of a big happy family, someone dies, everyone's sort of grieving together collectively. There's a big, funeral and there's rituals and everyone can kind of talk about the good times. But in this kind of situation, it's different. And so that's something that I think is probably relatable for a lot of folks. And then lastly, and you can chime in, Harriet, I had a couple friends share how many really weird, unusual things happened right at the time of the death of a parent or a loved one. Like things that seem almost supernatural or just a very, very strange coincidences or almost like occult-like things. So the same day that he passed, my best friend from 10 years ago, I don't know if I've mentioned this on the podcast, but I cut off contact with this friend I grew up with because of a meth addiction he developed in our teens. My other best friend had been in and out of prison. They were a little bit closer than I was to them. But he emailed me the same day my dad passed. I just crossed his mind, and just decided, hey, how are you doing? I was thinking about you. And I asked, did you know my dad died yesterday? He said, no. So I thought, oh, well, maybe he found out and then he wanted to check in. So total coincidence. And there was a really weird thing with a crow a couple days later, which I won't go into because it will just sound really weird. But in talking to some friends recently, they were saying, oh, yeah, like the night before my mom died, I had this really elaborate dream where she came to me and she told me X, Y, and Z about her life and those kinds of things. So apparently that's like a lot more common than is talked about. And so lastly, one topic we may or may not go into extensively here is this sort of question. So those of us that are on the more sort of Marxian side of things, we tend to either identify or be called the word, materialists. We start with this like materialist analysis of, what are the natural resources? What are the property relations? What's the material reality? You work your way up. That was sort of Marx's whole thing. And it seems like a much more intelligent way of analyzing society than just making a bunch of shit up and then, going from there.
Yeah.
But there is something that's often lost. Like I haven't read every word of Marx, but I doubt that he wrote about like people having weird dreams about their parents dying and having like weird sort of like animal encounters where animals are behaving in the most bizarre way you've ever seen around that time, or that you have some weird hallucination or vision or something like that. And so it's been making me just kind of reflect a lot this week on a lot of things. And then I realized a lot of other people reflect on these things, and we don't typically incorporate these sorts of things, whether it's supernaturalism, just generally reflecting on death and family and those things within, I think, the Marxist and socialist, cultures that we kind of overlap in. So that's all I got on that. But I figured Harriet being nearly 80 years old, I figured Harriet probably has experienced a lot of loss on that front. As you age, a lot of more people start dying around you. And I just figured you probably have a lot to say about this as well, Harriet. So
I do. But first, I want to say that as a Marxist, as a person who is a Marxist in New Marxism, which is not economic determinism, it doesn't say that the economy is the engine of life or history or anything else. It says that there are lots of entry points into Marxist analysis. It can be, you can enter and have a wonderful analysis of society the way Richard Pryor did by entryway through sex and sex work. Or you could have an entry point through psychology or anything else. And that the reason that Marx entered analysis with class is that class was then not recognized. And we live in a society in which class is the most repressed discourse. People will talk about sex, people will talk about race, people will talk about gender, but class is seldom on the agenda explicitly. Who produces the wealth and who gets to amass that wealth, and to whom is it delivered, whether it's in the household or whether it's in a factory. So that we are not class determinists. Right? The last academic piece that I did was a Marxist analysis in a collection whose subtitle was Marxism Without Guarantees. In other words, no definites here. And it was an analysis of sex work from a Marxian standpoint. And I think that long-winded preamble is saying that everything shapes everything else in a complexity we can't possibly capture. By the time we finished discussing the causes of something, we would have died. It's so complicated. And therefore, we don't really have a grip on things. We don't know And within that kind of Marxian analysis, you have the things in front of you, then you have your ideas about those things, whether those things are, a cup or whatever, and they have a real relationship to each other. The concrete real that you see and what you think about that and how you recognize that are related like two railroad tracks that go off into the distance that seem to converge, but they never really do. And there's a lot that we can never know. So that's one input that makes me think there's room for the supernatural. Another one is that the way we're brought up, where children are the semi-property of whoever got pregnant, no matter how utterly depraved or stupid or incapacitated or addicted those people are, means that we never develop our full potential. And so the supernatural may be something we don't understand yet because we're still such limited beings whose brains are not developed enough to encompass a lot of things that exist in the world. And so if you're a Marxist, you ought to have a lot of humility and humility around the supernatural. So that's one thing I'd want to say. And another thing is, I'm 79, so I've been around. All my parents' friends are dead. And our feelings about that really vary, And what I've come to is that you miss the person you were in that person's eyes or the person you hoped you would be. Because in every relationship you have, there's something unique in the way they see you and you see them that's not replicated by anyone else. And sometimes it just may not be clear. For many of my friends, the death of a parent is a real relief because, oh, good. One down who I loved because I couldn't help it and who could never love me back. What a relief. But for many who don't know their parents, it's a sense of lost possibility. I knew my father. I didn't exactly come from a happy family, and my parents were together. Perhaps it was a big mistake, but they were together, and their lives were fairly stable. And when my mother died, I was sad because it was the end of an era, but I sure don't miss her. And I don't miss my father either because they didn't see me as a person in my own right and rather kind of managed to do things they thought showed themselves that they were good parents that had very little to do with me. But, and I grew up as a bourgeois girl. My sister Rosalind, who died, has, and I wrote a chapter of a book about red diaper babies, and it was called Red Sisters of the Bourgeoisie, because our father was a communist, and that was the best thing about him. And that was the only way he could relate to us, by giving us books about heroes of different nationalities and races, and once in a while dropping a comment about his beliefs, because he only had cameo appearances in our lives anyway. But I think the whole idea of death is one that Americans are afraid of. Old people are shunted away, and we don't get to know them or see them. It's not like it used to be, where the old person was in your home. And some people have ways of recognizing death and accepting death that are moving. Like the Inuit people, always when someone was old and felt like their time on earth had run out, he or she or they went out to an ice floe and lay down, said goodbye to the people they wanted to say goodbye to, and went out and lay down until the cold took them.
Wow.
And that was part of life and explained as part of life. And yet we're segregated from death.
Right.
We're not even allowed to see the caskets being brought home when we're at war, because we were allowed to see them during the war in Vietnam. They decided never again once the anti-war movement was so strong.
I actually think there's an alienation that the Marxist idea of alienation too, of like, there's alienation from your own labor and the products and all of that stuff, but then from each other. One of the factors is because there's nothing of productive value. I mean, I'm sure there's the funereal sort of services industry and stuff has, it's an industry, right? But it's like, it's not like Jeff Bezos style, you can't make that much money off of it. Maybe it's in the millions or something nationally. Anyway, the point is that because there isn't really enough of a profit motive around, let's all sit around, let's all stand around the body together, let's take a week off of work, let's cry together, et cetera, right? That you have to have really significant economic privilege to even do something like that. Right. My friend who's from India had told me, because both her parents died, she told me that in India, this is whether you're Hindu or not, just very Hindu culture still, that you're considered impure after someone dies for about 2 weeks. So you can't go to work. You can't do anything for 2 weeks. And you have to just go and do like prayer stuff and all that. And you're just, you're just to cry, like nothing on a to-do list. You're like sort of not allowed to. I'm sure some people do. You're not supposed to do shit for 2 weeks. You're just supposed to feel, and then you come back and it's thought that you've been purified because you did stuff to sort of, converse with this. I don't know what it is. She didn't give me like a crash course or anything, but you do something for that 2 weeks. And I'm sure, every culture that hasn't been totally erased or annihilated by the powers that be over the last few hundred years has something like that, just some acknowledgement that there's something really significant that happens in death.
Yes.
Some sort of ritual that was created. But I do think there is a sort of alienation process that's like many, many generations deep now, where although there are funerals and stuff, and they've probably come from some iteration of like a Christian history in the US in particular, or Catholic history, we're so there's this concept. This is a really, really new thing. This thing called a death doula. I learned about it in a podcast of people who try to, in the same way that you'll have birth doulas, there's this idea of the death doula is you help not only from the person's death, but post-death. One example this woman gave is she actually encourages people to just sort of leave the body. Let's say if they die in the house or they die outside of the house, you bring them to the house, put them in the bed or wherever they used to hang out, and just leave them there for a couple of days, and everyone just goes and sits and talks to the body for a while. And people will say, "Oh, well, isn't it going to like start to smell and stuff?" She's like, "No, the decomposition actually takes a while. You can leave it for a few days. It's fine." And she said that everyone that does that ends up having this really profound experience. And I think it's because you're actually touching base with the real, so to speak, that the body is real. The person is now dead. And this is what a dead person looks like. They are no longer moving, right? Their life energy is gone, but
their color is gone.
Yeah, everything's gone, but you can talk to them. You can have a conversation. You can cry with them. It probably feels really uncomfortable, but then you probably desensitize to it, and you just, and then you have whatever you do, cremation or burial or whatever. But we don't, all of that's pretty inconvenient, I think, generally in our culture. We're not supposed to be in contact with it, nor are we supposed to prioritize it in any significant way.
Yeah, you're out of work that time too. So right. Americans are pushed to get back and make money for their employer. The Jews have that sitting Shiva, where you're supposed to, for 7 days, you're supposed to sit in your house, the house of the dead, and people come and pay their respects and talk. Mainly, they just eat a lot and maybe talk a little bit. And the wake is a place where Christians can talk about the person who died. But I think our culture doesn't want people to take time off from work for anything. We're the only advanced nation that doesn't give paid leave of any kind, either paid vacation or paid maternity and paternity leaves or paid bereavement leaves. Because money is being made and because we don't have a strong labor movement, socialist movement, anarchist, communist, whatever movements to insist that we are people rather than just machine accoutrements to produce.
Right. Well, some employers offer those things. It is funny though that it's like there's a competition amongst employers. Well, who can, how can we like fork over some benefits since the state's not going to, the state's just sort of serving capital accumulation to the maximal degree, and we just won't get in their way. So just let the employer.
Right.
Just what a what a stupid system. We have such a bad system.
Capitalism is bizarre, but also I think people go through a lot with death. When my father died, my mother actually had about 3 months period of honesty. Something was lifted from her and she could tell the truth about things that happened in their lives, about my father, about herself, that she never would have been able to reveal before.
Yeah.
And I think, before my sister died, my sister got cancer, I think, because she made a point that wherever she went, she would refill these thin water bottles that she got at Trader Joe and freeze them. And so she'd always have ice water. Well, it turns out they leach a chemical that causes kidney disease, which is what she got.
Wow.
And it killed her, although you can't prove that's what killed her.
Yeah.
So they have you. But before she died, we had about 3 hours before she died, we had a many hours long conversation where she apologized for bullying me as a child and for not being there in a way she wanted to, because she was kind of freed up. And before my father died, when his best friend and his doctor said the angel of death was hovering over his bed, he told his friend secrets about having mistreated me, which he was always embarrassed about and would never have discussed. That somehow what happens to people is they're not going to get another chance.
Yeah.
And sometimes they can reach out because the death of a loved one, or at least somebody that they were close with, reminds them that there aren't many chances, to be honest. And they better grab this before it passes.
Well, something that's been happening to me over the week, like I said, other than the kind of unusual occurrences and like weird coincidences that I'm like, that mathematically shouldn't be possible that this thing happened at this time in this place thing is just kind of thinking, in like attachment terms, like, I'm sure a lot of listeners know the attachment theory stuff, right? There's like secure, insecure, anxious, avoidant, all these types. But I was kind of thinking about it because I was like, I never thought I'd care that much, because when you have like this really sort of aggressive, violent, whatever kind of person, you would think you'd just be like, oh, well, good riddance, asshole, right?
Yeah.
But it felt like there was some kind of, and this is where I think Western science being this little baby, like the West being, like most indigenous cultures and like China, for example, that has like 4,000-year-old sort of indigenous, people don't call it indigenous anymore, but it's a very ancient sort of medical and sort of metaphysical, it's a very holistic sort of, medical way of thinking about things, that it's hard for us to think in. What I'm about to say is that on some level, I think there's actually a physical sort of connection that is sort of cut. So it's an attachment that's not just psychological, but something that, and not in the way that when we talk about brain science these days of these reductive, like, oh, it's the brain and your nervous system and stuff, but something that's maybe at this point beyond our sort of our scientific measurement tools ability to know, to observe, but something where there actually is a connection. And I don't mean like, oh, I feel a connection, like something that's beyond, if that makes sense. It's something beyond that is actually severed, because the sort of the physiological and emotional experience was, it actually felt really similar to when I got the vaccine. You know, the vaccine like killed us for 2 days, where you like couldn't do anything and you had headaches. Like it was actually so physiological that it was like totally beyond my control. And it really made me think, you know, I haven't had this kind of experience in a long time. And just that there is, the way our culture has been set up is really just this we're constantly just bombarded and distracted and overstimulated, and all of our these almost like superficial exploited use of senses are so like overshot all the time. I mean, especially for like my generation, Harriet, but just for the internet and social media and all this shit that's just so bad for us and exists for the purpose of capital accumulation and nothing else. And then people make up a bunch of bullshit about why, oh, well, no, I need to check Twitter. No, you don't. Like someone, no, you don't. You could just delete it forever. You'd be totally fine, you know? But like that there are things that I think our culture has made it so that we actually cannot get in touch with certain things that were probably obvious to people before this time, you know, that like that, when I say like the severing of that connection, that there's that connectivity, maybe even like a Jungian thing, right? I mean, Jung famously sort of took some of Freud's ideas about, say, the subconscious and said, well, you know, what if it's, instead of this sort of psychosexual development thing, if it's actually like this deeper collective conscious spiritual thing, where there's just maybe this unconscious like underworld. And I mean, I think the Jungian stuff is beautiful. Sometimes I'm like, it's a little bit much, feels a little bit out there. But in these kinds of moments, the feelings I've been having are moving me toward like, yeah, the Jungian stuff might be right, you know, that there's just something underneath that connects us, and then you feel it in certain moments, or you notice it in certain moments, but you don't in all moments because you're too focused on tasks and such. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think you feel it in a demonstration where you feel like, yes, we are united. Yes, I am part of something big. And that's one of the wonderful things about political organizing, that you're no longer the isolated individual. But I think that when a parent, even an inadequate, an absent parent dies, you are next. There's an awareness that within the scope of things, when your parent dies, then you are the next to do so, the next in line. And so there's a sense of our own looming death. Mm-hmm. And people are afraid of death in the United States. They don't make their peace with it, that you've lived, you've done what you needed to, and others will grow, and you will have influenced people if you tried, and you'll last in the kindnesses, in the effects, in all the little ways you touched other lives, and that's enough.
Yeah.
But I think that particularly the United States, with its emphasis on youth culture, and youth being the most important thing rather than experience, thoughtfulness, wisdom, which is different in other cultures.
Well, and even in spirituality, right? Like the way that sort of evangelical Christianity, I mean, the Christianity I was raised with in my family, that it's a very kind of bastardized, like I think what most people in the sort of mainstream evangelical and sort of right-wing Christian movement don't seem to understand historically is the history of the church as a political tool in Europe for like 1,000 years, as like eradicating everything that was people that were more land-based throughout Europe and had some connection to reality. You just wiped it all out. They're like, if you're a pagan, you're going to get tortured to death. If you're gay, tortured to death. If you're a witch, if you're a woman that wants to mess with like alchemy and stuff, you're murdered. And then eventually that kind of evolved into a kind of spirituality that is, because I will hand it to Christians for sure. and actually I know a lot of really awesome Christians, but the kinds of Christians I was raised by, I will hand it to them, despite I think ideological differences. They do have a sense of spirituality that I think is very fulfilling for them, and that I think a lot more Marxists could actually maybe dabble in a little bit. Not like I'm gonna get on my knees and pray to like white Jesus and think that the New King James by the what's it called, the Gospels, the like 4 books of the New Testament is like the literal word of God and stuff, because like I don't want to offend anybody, but it's just not. I'm sorry, it's just not. That's not real, right? Like they're metaphor. These are metaphors. They were always supposed to be metaphors. They were supposed to be. It was supposed to be storytelling, but once it was politicized into this sort of right wing format, I think, and then somehow lots and lots of people gobbled it up. I think because it was just very politically advantageous and strategic for certain political operatives to make Christianity that way. Our previous guest, I'm forgetting his name now, who we had on. He really eloquently kind of traces that history. But anyway, I do think that there is spirituality, and there is a sort of connectivity to the connectivity in certain parts of the U.S. for sure. And we do actually have we have a diversity of sort of religious and spiritual traditions. Some of which I think there is more of a groundedness to some of them, but to a lot of them they are. They're very sort of co-opted, and I think have been really misled.
Well, I think spirituality is the belief that you are part of something.
Yeah.
Which people feel in a family sometimes, and they can feel in a movement, is a spiritual thing that is transformative. Right.
Well, and it's beyond you, right? Like
yes.
It's even the higher power concept in AA and stuff, right? It's something beyond you. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah.
Yes, and a Marxist, if they're a sophisticated Marxist, would have a humility before that, because they would know that you cannot possibly know. You have to make decisions based on what you know and what you believe and what you think the social consequences of the actions you're about to take might be. But there's always, if you are a Marxist, there is always a humility that you can't know it all, and that there is always more. And also that the spirit of people doing something that is ennobling is a beautiful connector. And that spirit of connection, which is something without which therapy would fail. And why a lot of therapy does fail, because people sense if somebody doesn't care, or if they do.
Yeah.
And there is a sense that's spiritual, of connection with other human beings.
I don't know if, let me know if this is or is not relatable for you, Harriet, in the way you've practiced with clients. But something that I find often, it's a little bit embarrassing to say this, but if I'm either a little bit tired, a little bit depressed, or sometimes a little bit hungover with clients, which is not that often, by the way, if any clients are listening, I don't drink that much. But if my energy is lower, and I'm finding that I'm focusing more on, that I'm actually tracking the content, this very specific words and stories less, people are saying, sometimes it's actually easier to connect with them on that heart or spiritual level, because there's actually something more in the connection that's actually needed to kind of guide the healing. I don't know if that's making sense.
I think it does make sense, because I think that one of the things that's healing in therapy is the sense that you are not alone, that no matter what you go through and into, there's another being connected with you, listening and caring, because we're all social beings and we need that. And if that connection is real, if the person actually does care and is engaged and listens acutely because they care, that's a spiritual experience of being loved. And I think that really is healing for both the therapist and the client, who are connected.
And there is that concept Marx had in his theorizing of alienation around the species essence, and that idea of that there is something that's sort of, I think the concept of species essence was that at everyone's core as a human being, there is this like a deeper connectivity on, I think it's maybe like a German translation thing, so I don't know exactly what it meant, but the species level, right? There's like in your body and that somatic sense that we're connected to like the earth and the soil and the trees and the stars and all of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Marx even understood that, and there were other sort of more spiritual German philosophers at the time. I'm far too ignorant to go into on that, but that there is like that sort of essence within people, and that we all have the same capacity to connect to that, like on the self level and with the interpersonal level. But again, that if we are, and this is sort of the issue with capitalism, right? That if we are so alienated from that, right, that we just are sort of forced into these positions as all we can really do to survive is sell our labor, no connection to the work, the product, the managers, the bosses, maybe the educational institutions that give us maybe a more sort of middle class, comfortable working position, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of society is just sort of built that way. It's really hard to connect to your own so-called species essence and to others. So this is maybe a plug. I know I go back and forth on therapy in general sometimes, but a plug for therapy is that in a world where it seems so hard to connect with people on a real level, therapy is a nice place to do it, right? Assuming your therapist is doing it. I guess there's some people say you got to find a good therapist because not every therapist is good, right? I guess that's true. I guess there's some crappy therapists, but it's important, right? And you always say this, Harriet, just that the point is whether we're just talking about the sort of the connection, whether it's just if we're just talking about people and we're not talking about the political connection is important, but in the political sense, it all foundationally goes back to connectivity as well.
It does, but one of the things that therapy can accomplish is connectivity to who you are, because we are all similar and we're all part of life. And we all share basic feelings and needs. And so the more you connect to your authentic self, the person that's real in you, often that person has to be compromised in order to get any kind of love at all. And so you learn that that person better shut up and be replaced by what another person wants. But when you reconnect with your own feelings and needs, you're in continuity with the feelings and needs all around you of other human beings. And if therapy is successful, it lets us be honest about our own feelings and needs. And it reminds me that in the parenting studies, there's only one element of parenting that they predict will make a good parent. It's only one thing, and that is the ability to have compassion for yourself as a child, to see your own pain and your own neediness, which then allows you to relate to a child in a different way as a little being, which changes it.
I think there's something similar even when I was working with like juvenile sex offenders at the clinic I was at, where, if perpetrators are able to, because if you try to start with like, well, we need to make sure you have empathy for the person you hurt, it never actually works well if you start with that. But if you start to figure out, well, how did you get hurt? And if you actually get them to move there, because most of the time they're like, oh, well, nothing ever happened to me. I'm fine. Or I'm this tough guy, or I'm, this like totally numbed, like disaffected person. If you finally figure out like, oh, well, the way your dad did the thing, or that your mom died when you were 3 or something, you actually get there. It's never guaranteed. It's like they might still go out and offend. But I always found over the years doing that see, at least it seemed to have better results, that they were like connecting to something real just by being like, oh shit, I really got hurt at some point. Yes. And you can presumably then translate that into, well, now that I know what it's like to be hurt, maybe I shouldn't hurt other people so much.
And in addition, what happens is, in my experience working with sex offenders, is that they are trying, all the bizarre crap that people do is some kind of attempt to health.
Right. And to connect. Yeah, weirdly.
In their acting out, by abusing someone else, they're trying to get in touch with their abuse.
Right.
And if they can get in touch with it and feel it and have someone be with them, hear them, be what one of my clients who was really very smart, he'd say, "You're my fellow traveler," you know, because I could go with him. And so he wasn't alone. Even looking at the most awful stuff, he wasn't alone. And that makes all the difference, because what we've been threatened with as we grow up is that we have our authentic self who wants to be expressive in the world, but we also need to attach to a person who will ensure our survival. And so we cast aside the authentic person we are in order to survive. And then we need to bring that back. And when we do, we have a capacity for empathy, beginning with empathy for us and extending outward. And I don't think that people who are acting out on other people have empathy for themselves or anyone else. They're acting out something. In fact, there's an excellent book by a person who studied people on death row for grisly crimes. And she wrote a paper called "From His Cradle to Your Grave." And she talked to them, and what they were actually acting out was what happened to them as kids.
Right.
Trying to get a hold of it.
You know, I went to like a sex offender treatment conference a couple of years ago, and they, so funny that we just went from death of a parent to this, but appropriately enough, my dad was an offender of all of these types. So it actually does connect to that too. But they actually found that the research showed that there was a somewhat higher prevalence for male offenders of sexual abuse if there was more severe neglect and maltreatment in childhood than sexual abuse. So it was always interesting, because I know for a long time people were saying, "Oh, well, all these guys must have been sexually abused as kids." And I actually found that some have been, but more were neglected and just maltreated. And that's a really broad category, like maltreatment and neglect, right? Because the neglect could just be you have a mom, just a single mom who's on drugs and she's just not paying attention. It could mean that you have a two parents and the mom is just sort of she's sort of there, but dad's always working. I mean, there's a lot of variations of what neglect even means, and maltreatment as well. It's like it could be, and they usually differentiate it from things like physical abuse and stuff. So it's not necessarily being physically or sexually abused, but just sort of no one's really giving you the connection that you need as the child was what that is, neglect and maltreatment. So it makes sense from what you're saying too, that if you're devoid of that connection as a child, you find a really inappropriate way of forcing a connection with somebody in the same way that it's gonna create the same, not the same, but really similar consequences for the other person subject to it, in the same way that the people who didn't have an appropriate connection to you created for you. That's right. How it works.
And I think for a lot of symptomatic behavior, whether it's addiction or sex abuse, you are trying to express something that you need to get out, and at the same time punish yourself for it, because you know that it's wrong and you'll get in trouble. And when people abuse other people, they're often dissociated because they're acting out something and they don't want to know what it is.
Right.
So that they, anything really symptomatic meets at least two mutually contradictory needs. And abuse allows one to act out and know, and yet not to know.
I want to share one last thing about my dad, and then we don't have to go too much longer into this, but it's actually funny and very sad. My uncle sent me a thing yesterday because his brother went and got his possessions in the motel room, which was not much. There's like two or three little objects or something, but one of them was some receipt for $600 that he sent to somebody in Africa, in like South Africa or something. And I immediately knew that, so the $600 either was just a stimulus check payment or something that he made. I mean, he always found like weird little like buying umbrellas for cheap and then selling them for a few bucks more. So he always had just like these little sort of shitty hustles to just make little bits of money here and there. it's so sad just talking about this, but I'm not going to cry on the podcast, I promise. But the $600 thing, it was like, I remember like my girlfriend was like, "Oh, do you think that was a scam?" when I told her about it. And I was like, "Oh, that didn't cross my mind, but that's a possibility, like the Nigerian prince thing or something." But he's actually always had this really weird obsession with Africa in the way, like he wanted to be like a minister. He wanted to like go to Bible school, become a minister, go to Africa and like help it's like kind of the pinnacle of like the white savior thing, honestly, but in this really endearing way. Like if you go away from the judgmentalism, you're like, man, so you like, you tried to kill your wife and you were like, I'm not going to pay child support because I'm not going to give that bitch a dime, and I'm just going to live on the streets and I'll go to jail if I have to. Like this is my father.
Mm-hmm.
But you're going to live on the streets and like somehow acquire pennies and then send them to Africa because in your mind and in your heart, you think that is the sort of Christian good thing to do. I mean, it's kind of insane, but it's also extremely beautiful. I just have to say, like the complexity of human beings, right? You can be the most bizarre, violent, strange person. And then there's like a secret, because no one was even supposed to know about that. I mean, it's kind of on some level fucked up I'm airing this, but like, this is a secret that we found in his death in his motel room. But he sent $600 to some random person in Africa. Like maybe it was a church person. It could have been someone trying to scam people. But I mean, whatever. They're sitting there being a victim of like hundreds of years of colonialism. So, who gives a shit? But, but that's my dad for you. It's just very
full of contradictions. That's
full
right.
of contradictions, like total, like you couldn't classify him fully as a perpetrator or a victim or mentally ill or anything. I mean, I think on some level, the gift is the complexity through which I see human beings, and that, that you and I share this thing of like, well, we can call it mental illness, but we should put it in air quotes, and the DSM is full of shit. Contact with him in part is why I think this way, that I see the complexity of human beings.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to say that wonderful book about how violent acts are repetitions of childhood trauma is by Abby Stein, Stein. And there's another really great book. And it's great in a lot of ways. It's truly profound, but it's not written in academies. It's accessible. It's called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog and Other Stories from a Child Psychiatrist's Notebook by Bruce Perry and Maya Salovitz. And there's one about a boy whose mother just couldn't relate to him at all, who became a violent killer. But they're all told with compassion, and they're all told with wisdom and depth. And I think that America has to face that whatever people do that's outside the law, they need to get a hold of themselves and be transformed, and so that they can be free. And there's a wonderful book by someone who was a prison lawyer and who had an experimental prison where people really thrived and didn't repeat crimes, which is called Dreams from the Monster Factory by Susie Schwartz, because she worked with prisoners. She redesigned a prison experiment, which was so successful they never did it again, where there weren't walls everywhere and where guards mingled among prisoners and where everyone had to be in a group therapy with male and female patients separated and prisoners separated and process what went wrong. And it was a transformative experience.
Yeah.
At any rate, we started this podcast talking about the death of Max's father and about how we can't get our minds around death, which has ramifications that can be supernatural because we really can't get a hold of the complexity of life. And we're not given much help either.
Yeah. Well, Well, thanks for going for this, Harriet, for this one. We'll do something that's not a therapy session next time.
Well, it wasn't just a therapy session. It was,
sure.
It was so much more that you were willing to use your experience.
Sure.
To show reality.
And dear listeners who are maybe consumers of mental health services, we call this self-disclosure. It's supposed to be used strategically. So for the podcast, hopefully it was used strategically to be helpful for someone else. Yes. So in any case, we should probably close out. I forgot to thank the patrons in the beginning, so I'll just say thank you in particular to First Winter, Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns, Justin Harper, and Bandila MC Munga. And always, Liam, thank you for doing the editing and social media. And if you guys any listeners want to become a patron, you get early access to episodes, a Discord channel, and monthly reading groups.
And our monthly reading group is about borderlines, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, for this one. Well, when this is published, it'll be it'll have passed. Yeah, so the timing is weird. But anyway, if you want to join that, and if you become a patron, you get to propose things to read too. It's Harriet and I influence the decision, but patrons usually have actually more influence than we do technically. So
yes.
if you want to force us to read stuff, become a patron and make us read stuff.
Yes.
So just go to patreon.com/it's not just in your head. If you want to email us directly, any feedback, thoughts, criticisms, anything, it's not just in your head @gmail.com.
And again, share this podcast. You may not be able to afford to give us on Patreon right now. We'll love you anyway, but send it around, because we want listeners and enthusiasts and thinkers to join us.
Yeah, share it with your therapist. Turn your therapist into a Marxist.
Yes.
All right. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life, as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work, or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.